Welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 4, Episode 7. I'm Jenna Jondro, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Season 4 of Chebacco Chats is sponsored by Machias Savings Bank. We are grateful for their continued support of our exhibits and programs. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format, so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. When you use the chat feature, you have the option to send a message to the hosts or to everyone, which will include fellow audience members. Today, I'm speaking to Tim Garrity, who was the Executive Director of MDI Historical Society and historian, and who is zooming in from Blue Hill today. He has the prestigious title of being the most published Chebacco author, and also is the creator of Chebacco Chats. So is no stranger to this, this program, and it's really great to have you here today, Tim. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Jenna. Glad to be here. And hi, everybody.
So I am going to start sharing my screen. And while I do that, I would love to learn a little bit more about the context for your article in the upcoming edition of Chebacco, which is the maritime edition. And your article is about a mutiny aboard the vessel. It's nicknamed Berwind, so mutiny aboard the Berwind. And where did this article kind of come from? What is its origin story?
Well, Jenna, I was aware that there was an artifact in our collection called a taffrail. It's sort of like a odometer for sailing vessels. It's hangs off the back of the boat, the taffrail, and is dragged through the water. And there was a Barris note attached to it that said it was owned by Captain Edwin Rumill of Pretty Marsh, and that he died in a mutiny in 1905. And I did a very casual and insufficient search, and I really didn't find anything about a mutiny in 1905. And at the time, I was working on turning over all kinds of myths and legends, like the Norwood Cove object was thought to be a relic of the Saint-Sauveur settlement, but actually was a piece of World War I folk art that a soldier brought home from France. And there was once a cemetery on Fernal Point that was purported to be the burial place for one of the French Jesuits that were there in 1613. So I was on a whole loop of identifying things that turned out to be not quite true. So I had my antenna up for this, that maybe this is not quite true. And once I started working on this issue, the maritime issue of Chebacco, I found out that actually there's a lot of substantial information about this event. In fact, one of my predecessors, Jaylene Roth, had written a whole biography of Captain Rumill and had done thorough searches of archives all over the East Coast. And there was a substantial amount of information. And I talked to Jaylene and I asked if I could tap into her research files, and she was very generous with that. So that's how it started. I got interested in this, and when the maritime history issue came up, Rainey gave me the go-ahead to pursue this.
That's a great backstory. And in your article, you reference that it's not a well-known MDI local history story, but it's a really fascinating segment of history, and a lot of interesting social concerns are at play in this one segment. So let's get into your slideshow here. What am I going to be looking at? Aha, This sounds like something I just heard about.
So
The
that's
infamous.
the taffrail, yeah, where this whole question came up for me, and that's that is an artifact we have in our collection, one of the few that we have of the Berwind, or at
And it
least
was
of Captain
donated.
Rummel. This may not be from the Harry A. Berwind, but it was owned by Captain Rummel, and this was donated by Captain Rummel's granddaughters. By Gail Reber and Joanne Whitney, who have been very generous donators of artifacts to the Historical Society.
Okay, so this, and that's one of the fascinating, Tim, I hope that you recover quickly from your cold and you're a champion for being here. So this is a great example of finding something in the collection that has just this, well, hidden to the society at that time, backstory and provenance and history, and yet something existed that was a really great historical resource for you. So thank you to Jaylene for her incredible contributions to the story in publishing that book and making that research available to you. So you've mentioned Captain Rummel. That was his taffrail log, though it may not have been on the Berwind, it was his. And he's grandfather to Gail. So tell me a little bit about him, his family, and he was the captain of the Berwind, which is the focal vessel of your article.
Well, Captain Rummel was a mariner for over 30 years, and traveled the seven seas. And in his 30 years at sea, he was home, Jaylene estimates, a total of about 2.5 months. So in that time, he had he was married. He had two children. Returned infrequently to Pretty Marsh, and spent most of his time at sea. And one of the things that Jaylene and I hope to work on together is a presentation this summer at the Northeast Harbor Library.
So that
On
program,
go
if
ahead, yeah.
you, yeah, sure. If that program will be on August 24th at 6 p.m. at the Northeast Harbor Library. And we're really excited that Tim and Jaylene are going to talk more about this article, this topic, the Rummel family, and as I understand it, the women in Edwin Rummel's life and how women were impacted by this maritime industry. And so one of the interesting things about this story and your article is it shows what was at risk. We talked a little bit in previous episodes of Chebacco Chats about risks and rewards on the high seas. And Captain Rummel came up against one of those risks in a really violent and fatal way. So what's a little bit more about that part of this story?
Well, the ideal Chebacco story tells a bit of local history and also connects it to the larger world. And I think what I tried to do with this one is to show how, though we often have a romanticized view of the days of sail and the great ships that the voyages of travel around the world, there's a reality that is revealed in this story, that life at sea was really hard and violent. The conditions that sailors worked under were absolutely brutal. A 1874 government study said that life at sea is worse than any prison. And it was also a place where African American sailors could find an alternative that was marginally better than a life of enslavement or working in the Jim Crow South under some conditions. So this story tells us about that history of violence, the conditions that people worked under that ultimately drew one crew member of the Harry A. Berwind to a murderous outcome. And it also tells us about there's a story of redemption at the end of this, that this story resolves in a way that even though there was this terrible tragedy at sea, in the end, there's a little bit of a forerunner of the criminal justice movement, or the racial justice and efforts at that time, even in 1905. So this story ties in a lot of those elements.
I found it interesting when I read that on board many of these vessels, there was, oh, I apologize if I went ahead. We can go back or stay on this slide if
Yeah,
you
why don't you
want.
go back a little bit, and let me talk about what the experience was for Mount Desert Islanders. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead, Jenna.
Sure. That was just me trying to click ahead accidentally. So I was interested in the fact that there was segregation on board these vessels as well. So even though there people on MDI who might be from white populated areas had a lot of diversity in their crew, and that didn't necessarily mean that it was all integrated. It was still segregated. So yes, let's talk about let's talk about the Islanders' experience.
So the chief example is someone we have really terrific records from, and that's Augustus Savage, A.C. Savage, who was on board a naval vessel during the Civil War. And we have a collection of his letters back and forth to his wife. And what he wrote in 1854, when he was taking a merchant ship to Jacksonville, he wrote back, "I have not seen anything but Negroes since I've been here." So sailors would grow up in an environment on MDI where anybody who wasn't white was a fairly rare sight. And once they went to sea, they had a very diverse mix of people. When Savage was on board the USS Delaware during the Civil War, he served alongside African Americans, Irish immigrants, and others from 13 states and 8 countries. And he wrote to Emily, his wife, that about half of them were Black. And there's a good reason that he would encounter Black men at sea, because Blacks made up a very significant population of the maritime crews. And it was a place where you would expect to see Black men. In fact, Frederick Douglass used the disguise of a free Black sailor to make good his escape when he fled enslavement in Maryland in 1838. So it was a place where Black men could find independent employment, even though it was hard going.
I did just have a flag pop up in my head about Islanders encountering a non-white face being more of a rarity. At 1905, quick question, the Wabanaki communities that were coming to MDI and selling baskets and all that, would they have been around seasonally around this time, as opposed to African Americans and things like that? Would that have been a presence that Islanders were accustomed to, as opposed to those they met on their sails?
Very much so. Yeah,
Okay.
throughout the 19th century, they were frequently, there's records in the early 1830s, 1840s of Wabanaki people encamped at Somes Pond. And of course, it's well documented that they had a summer encampment in Bar Harbor, where they were part of the scene, part of the summer scene in Bar Harbor.
So it is really fascinating to read some of these journals from these sailors about their encounters on their journeys. And I was fascinated with his seafaring experience he wrecked multiple times. Maybe not as a captain, but he was involved in multiple shipwrecks. And so he wasn't a fresh captain when we enter this story, correct?
He was very salty, let's say, and it was just hard. I mean, he served on every kind of vessel as progression went from one master to two master to three master to finally the Berwind was a four master. He also served on a U.S. naval ship, which was a steamer, which he found incredibly boring just to go smoking along endlessly in the Pacific. So it was, yeah, he experienced about everything you could at sea, including an episode of violence that kind of foretells what could have happened. There was a story of him in a physical encounter with one of his crewmen in which he choked the crewman and the cook, in fact, and he suspected that the cook, in retaliation, poisoned him. He thought he might not survive the next meal he got from the cook.
You don't mess with the cooks. You don't, it's
Yeah.
like by anywhere you are, you don't mess with the cooks.
So it was routine. Discipline was routine. It was part of the understanding. And those records go back as far as we know to 1613, when Samuel Argall sailed up here and raided the French encampment at Saint-Sauveur, and he made two trips. And on the second trip, he hanged two of his own crewmen for some offense that's not named. Perhaps it was mutiny or insubordination. Abraham Soames, sort of the quintessential colonial figure, wrote in his diary that this is Thaddeus Soames. He's came of age in the 1860s. He wrote in a schoolboy essay that the common sailor has to stand watch day after day and night after night, and then thinks himself lucky if he gets a junk of salt pork and a cracker and gets into the forecastle without a kick. Augustus Savage, his USS Delaware was seething with internal strife. It was almost like they were more at war within the crew than they were against the Confederates. One of the Delaware's officers was shackled with iron cuffs for striking a member of the crew, and the crew member was put in irons for insolence toward the officer. So it was routine that harsh discipline was meted out.
I mean, if it says it's kind of like a prison on sea, it makes it doesn't seem, like you said, as romantic as we might imagine.
Right.
So Captain Rumill, the salty captain who is experienced, and he also ran, a pretty tight crew. Correct?
Yes.
So, what can you tell me about his leadership on the Berwind and what his sailors felt about their experience there?
Well, the Berwind was manned by an 8-man crew. There were 4 officers, all white. Captain Rumill. There was an engineer, a cook, and oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the other title. But four white men and 4 black men on board the crew. And the white men were sort of a tighter group and apart from the black men. And there was a great deal of racial strife aboard the ship, and that kind of set the scene for combined with heat, incredible hot weather in Cuba and off the coast of Florida and Alabama, and very difficult working conditions and abysmal food, beans day after day after day. Apparently the coffee was execrable, so that supposedly was the serving bad coffee was said to be the match that lit the bomb of the uprising on board the Berwind. And maybe we ought to go to the next slide and kind of set the scene for
Yes,
how that
because
happened.
your article opens with an incredible setting of the scene, which I I loved. So we have another character out of, well, person out of history who is captaining a boat as well. And we kind of get things from his perspective a little bit at the beginning of the article.
Okay, so it begins October 10th, 1905, off the coast of North Carolina by Cape Fear, which was a common shipping route. John Taylor, the captain of the Blanche King, was about 30 miles off the coast. He was making his way from Georgia to Philadelphia with a load of railroad cross ties. And he looked out into the night to see a four-masted schooner sailing erratically outside the usual ship channel with a red light hanging from its rigging. And Taylor recognized the vessel as the Harry A. Berwind, captained by his friend Edwin Rumill of Mount Desert Island. And across the water, Taylor heard a man cry out, "For God's sake, come to our assistance. We got a man here who has killed the captain, the mate, the engineer, and the steward, and just now killed a sailor." And Taylor dispatched his mate and 3 sailors in a small boat to investigate. And what they discovered when they came aboard the Berwind was one of the worst cases of mutiny and mass murder in American maritime history. When the small boat came up to the side of the Berwind, you have to imagine what this looked like in the moonlight, in the dark. The Berwind is enormous. It's 200 feet long, 38 feet wide. It has 4 tall masts. And when the small boat from the Blanche King came alongside, 2 men, Robert Sawyer and Arthur Adams, looked down on them from the rail. And a 3rd man, Henry Scott, was on deck, bound in chains and strips of canvas. And that was the start of this scene unfolding, this small boat encountering these 2 men, 2 desperate men, 1 man tied up, 1 man and a man dead on the roof of a cabin, and 4 officers of the ship missing. The crew's lanterns showed this horrific scene. The Berwind was missing part of one of its 4 topmasts. Its hull was leaking. Its rudder was broken. They found the body of a crew member, John Coakley, atop the cabin. The captain's cabin had been ransacked, and in various parts of the ship, pools of blood indicated the location of multiple violent crimes. Of the crew's 8-man crew, of the Berwind's 8-man crew, only the 3 men taken aboard the King remained alive. That was Robert Sawyer,
It's Arthur Adams.
Arthur Adams and
then Henry Scott.
Henry Scott. Yeah, sorry. Only those 3 men remained alive, and the Coakley was dead on board, and all the officers were gone. So, of the 8-man crew, the 4 white officers were missing. 1 of the black men was dead, and 3 of them were in custody on board the Blanche King. So this was immediately interpreted as a race mutiny, an uprising of the black men against the white. The Ellsworth American reported Captain Edwin Rumill with 4 of his crew was murdered on the high seas by mutinous Negroes. And the Statesville, North Carolina Landmark headlined "Mutiny and Murder on the Sea." 3 Negroes who murdered their companions on a vessel were brought to Wilmington in irons. And the story that spills out and unwinds from here is that the Berwind had departed Philadelphia in July 1905. And I think to tell this story, you have to picture the heat and how uncomfortable it was. It left Philly with 1,000 tons of coal bound for Cardenas, Cuba on July 6th. And the ship's log recorded multiple episodes of dissent and argument. Henry Scott was reported as being insolent and insubordinate and threatening to kill the captain before the voyage ended. Another man, Robert Sawyer, called the cook a goddamn white son of a bitch, and the cook called Sawyer a black son of a bitch. So, and Sawyer threatened to beat and wipe the deck with the cook. So there was outright expressions of threats and violence on the way to Cuba. And then when the Berwind left Cuba and set sail for Mobile, Alabama, where the ship was loaded with lumber to take to Philadelphia, there it's believed that Henry Scott, one of the black men who was apprehended, provisioned himself with 2 pistols and brought them on board. So this atmosphere of hostility, the presence of this very angry man, Henry Scott, and others in this general sense of uproar, and armed with pistols, that it almost seemed like violence was bound to happen once the ship left Alabama and started heading for Philadelphia. When the men were brought ashore, they were assumed to have been in cahoots together, all 3, the mutineers. What later emerged in testimony was that actually Henry Scott was the sole instigator of the violence, and that he woke up in the morning of October 10th, and he started shooting the Berwind's officers, beginning with Captain Rumill. Then he shot the mate, the engineer, and the cook. And later court testimony revealed that at least 2 of the men were still alive when he threw them overboard. He forced Adams, Sawyer, and Coakley, now the last of the crew, to help him steer the ship. You can imagine this is a huge ship, you can't sail it yourself. And the crewmen attempted to overwhelm Scott and restrain him. And in the process, Scott shot and killed Coakley, leaving only Adams and Sawyer, who finally succeeded in overpowering Scott and tying him up on top of one of the cabins. So that's the situation the Blanche King encountered. And I think
it wasn't identified who called out to Taylor about the situation when they arrived.
That was Adams and Sawyer.
It was Adams
Henry
and Sawyer
Scott,
that were like, good Lord, please.
Yeah, the murderer was tied up at that point. Scott and Adams and Sawyer were the ones who called out.
So they were all brought on board, apprehended, as you say, and brought on shore. And what happened kind of at that point? It wasn't easy going for any of these men.
Now the racial component comes in, because they were brought aboard in Wilmington, North Carolina, brought ashore at Wilmington, North Carolina, and they were subjected to, they were in the Jim Crow South. And this was an atmosphere where lynching was common in North Carolina. A man had been lynched in a nearby town only 6 weeks previously. And the general assumption and all the communication around this, the newspapers, the conversation, was just certain that these men had committed the mutiny. And Henry Scott blamed Adams and Sawyer, and Adams and Sawyer contended that Henry Scott was the sole perpetrator of the crimes. And Adams and Sawyer, since Scott was perceived to be the ringleader, Adams and Sawyer were tried first. They were convicted and sentenced to hang. Henry Scott's trial followed immediately afterwards, and he was found guilty and sentenced to hang for murder on the high seas. The executions of all of them were stayed until July 1906, so a period of about 6 or 7 months, while attorneys for Adams and Sawyers filed an appeal. And while they were confined in their cell, a Protestant minister came to minister to them in prison, and Adams and Sawyer never wavered in their declarations of innocence, but under the minister's influence, Scott confessed fully to the murder of the Berwind officers and Coakley and exonerated Adams and Sawyer. And based on that information, Adams and Sawyer's appeal went to the president, Theodore Roosevelt, who commuted their sentences from death to life, and Scott was executed. Scott stood on the scaffold and read aloud his confession, and he explained that the conflict that led to the killings was due to the captain's withholding of food and water and cruel work conditions. At the very end, Scott and the assembled officials and witnesses sang 3 verses of Nearer, My God, to Thee. When the hymn was finished, Scott said, "Let her go, goodbye all," and the trap was released. And meanwhile, and let's move on down to the prison portraits of Adams and Sawyer. That's the deck of the Berwind, the day after it was discovered. That's a headline in the New York Times in 1905, jumping to conclusions about what was going on. This is a picture of Henry Scott, who was convicted of the murder and executed. And now here is Robert Sawyer and Adams. And they were brought to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And Scott's confession and exoneration of these guys led to a new round of pleadings on their behalf. There was many efforts to try to free these guys. And Adams somehow encountered a story in the New York Times that mentioned that a New York actor, a famous New York actor named H.B. Warner, had taken up the cause of men sentenced to life in prison. And he wrote Warner a letter asking to intervene in his case. Can you go to the next slide, Jenna? This is H.B. Warner. And his name may seem unfamiliar to you, but I promise you know who he is. And we'll have a big reveal later. But Warner did intervene on their behalf, and he sent his personal attorney, Mr. Bueller. Can you show him in the next slide, Jenna? And Bueller was a skilled attorney, a real mensch of a guy. And he went down to North Carolina, and he found that the judge, most of the jury, and even the prosecutors agreed that Sawyer and Adams had nothing to do with the crime, that they were innocent. And this information was eventually assembled for the now president of the United States, Howard Taft. And Taft was not willing to pardon the men, but was willing to commute their sentences to the time served. And they were freed. And it turns out that Sawyer went to work for H.B. Warner, the actor, as a personal valet, and Adams went to work for the attorney Bueller as a personal assistant. And thereafter, what happened to them after that is lost to history. So that is that's the story of the Berwind mutiny and its aftermath.
Okay, I stopped sharing for a second, but I'm going to reshare again. And that is because I didn't select the setting earlier that we need. Are you seeing my screen again, Tim?
Yeah, I have Bueller in front of me, the attorney.
Great, we are all set now. So you can continue as you were.
You're gonna tell us who H.B. Warner is?
Yes, you were mentioning that they ended up, they got jobs after that they were released from prison. And in the photograph that we saw earlier of them, if I could go back, I don't know how well this will work here. In this image right here, I have a quick question about what is on the back of their heads here.
I think that's an old-timey photographic method. There's like a steel frame to make the photographs all uniform. There was like a bracket that they had to lean back into to keep their head upright and still.
With photographic methods at that time, it might have been helpful if you had to hold your head for a long period of time.
I think it was pretty advanced, but I think maybe it's just to standardize the mugshot.
Okay. And then going back to this image here, this was the next in The
So
series, and
this
this
is,
was Robert Sawyer. Okay.
yeah, pictured as a valet to the actor H.B. Warner, who was really well known, almost like the Tom Hanks of his time. He was very well known in his prime, in the silent era. I think he played Jesus in a silent movie, and also on stage. He was very well known, and he was very well known as an activist, kind of a forerunner of the Innocence Project.
Interesting. Okay, so you said we were going to have a big reveal here.
Yeah, H.B. Warner's most famous role. Jenna's about to show us H.B. Warner's most famous role.
Here we go.
Come right away. Don't you know that boy's a sick?
Ernie, my store here.
You lazy loaf.
Mr. Gower, you don't know what you're doing. You put something wrong in those capsules. I know you're on it. B, you got the...
There it
Mr.
is.
Mr. Gower in It's a Wonderful Life. This, of course, was toward the end of his career when that film was made. But in aftermath, you can say that each of that Warner had a long film career, including in It's a Wonderful Life. Bueller went on to represent many show business personalities, including Greta Garbo, and he worked to organize the entertainment industry to oppose Nazism and support the welfare of American troops. Captain Rummill's widow, Letty, and I'm hopeful that you'll have the opportunity to see Jaylene's expand on the effect of this event on the women at home and throughout MDI in August. But Captain Rummill's widow, Letty, bore her grief heavily. Her daughter, Edna, said her mother would sit by the window where she once watched her husband return from the sea and cry for hours. The two children of Captain Rummil, there was young George. He grew up to become an early aviation pioneer, hunting submarines off the coast of England in the First World War, performing as a stunt pilot and flying cargo planes during the Second World War, and working in commercial aviation until his retirement in 1955. And Edna Rummil became a drama teacher and married Ross Hysom in 1930. And Edna and Ross had two daughters, Joanne and Gail, who we know. And Edna Hysom was a contributor to many historical collections throughout the island, places like the Southwest Harbor Library. And she lived to be 100. She was a font of historical memories for families and local libraries and historical societies. Oh, and as for the Berwind itself, the ship, it was put back into service soon after the mutiny, but as one newspaper put it, the Berwind never had a day's luck from the hour she slid off the ways at Millbridge, Maine in December 1895. In 1906, less than a year after the mutiny on the Berwind, the vessel wrecked on the Isle of Pines near Havana. A headline announced her epitaph: "The ill-fated vessel is gone at last."
Were any men lost in that wreck, according to that article, or it was just...
I didn't see that. I didn't note the loss of life in that wreck.
It had already seen its fair share at that stage. So hopefully none. Hopefully none. We had a question about what happened on the Berwind, so thank you for answering that. And then Carl Little chimed in. I think he said amazing, and that was after our It's a Wonderful Life clip was shown, which I loved too. So I welcome any questions and comments from the group. You can put those in the chat. And Tim, are we wrapped up on the Berwind story, or is there anything else that you wanted to include about that? I know we are going to be having an in-person event in Northeast Harbor Library this August. That's August 24 at 6 p.m. And that will be with you and Jaylene. So that's something I hope everyone will turn out for.
Well, I think I kind of end with a question for people to think about, and that is for people who know, are familiar with the history of Mount Desert Island and encountered many different versions of histories that are told. How come this story is so much on the down low? How come this is not a story that is often told. There are so many others that are told over and over and over again. And how come this one misses out? I don't have a good answer for that, but I'm curious about it because, and maybe, it's a time, it's a time when we're aware of the racial divide and question matters of race and injustice are kind of forefront in our headlines, very much as it is, as much as it was in 1905. And I think that it gives us a chance to think about in a more realistic way, I hope, of what life at sea must have been like for sailors of that era. And especially that were difficult and became more so if you were of African descent and fell into the hands of the criminal justice system.
Carl says one moral of the story is to make sure the coffee is good. Yes, because it will set people on edge.
Yeah, think of all the marriages ruined by bad coffee.
Right. Yes.
Breakups, it's just terrible. Can't do that.
Even in relationships among, roommates.
Yeah.
It's a significant thing and it's very important. Shucks, I had a question, but Carl's excellent comment got me off my train of thinking. No, don't apologize, Carl. I love it. It's great. It's great. So you were talking about why this story wasn't actively told, and I do think that that's an interesting question. Are you doing any additional research on this, or is there something else that you are working on at historians and writers tend to never let the pen go down, hopefully. So what's on your desk?
I have an assignment for the 2024 issue of Chebacco, and that is to write about the College of the Atlantic and its program of bringing international students into the community. The focus there will be on how the world influenced MDI and how MDI influenced the world. So these scholars from throughout the world have come onto the island. The program is now over 20 years old, and I'd like to discover what kind of effect it had, both here on MDI and throughout the world. So I'm going to pursue that.
We had a comment from Bill Horner that said, read Dana's 2 years before the mast for a great discussion of shipboard discipline, including flogging.
Yikes.
Yikes,
okay, Bill.
for sure. Eek.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of something I wanted to mention earlier, which is you mentioned the sheer size of the Berwind. And for anyone who has ever been on the Margaret Todd in Bar Harbor, that has done tours out front of the Bar Harbor Inn, they have 150-foot four-masted schooner. So it's 50 feet, correct? Shorter than the size of the Berwind. And if you've ever seen that in the Frenchman Bay, going around Porcupine Islands and coming back in into Bar Harbor, it's a very astounding vessel. And this one was even larger than that. So that's a pretty, I worked for them years ago, and one of my favorite memories in life is being on that pier and waiting to catch the boat coming in, and it was socked in with fog, and I could hear the crew and everyone aboard talking and laughing, and a musician was playing like a Bob Dylan song, and it was so great. And I am not from a coastal area, so it was a truly impactful moment for me, and it involved a four-masted schooner. So what was the cargo? Jane Foley asks, what was the cargo of the Berwind? And you mentioned that they stopped, they were on their way to Cuba, but I think I saw in there that they picked up more than one
they were carrying coal to Cuba and lumber from Alabama.
And I saw somewhere that there was a vessel carrying railroad ties. Was that the vessel that found them?
That was the Blanche King. Yes,
The Blanche King
that
was
was that vessel.
carrying railroad
So,
ties. So yeah, just
so
an
this is
interest,
Route 95. This is like Route 95.
right.
Stuff that was carried on trucks today that was carried at sea then.
And they recognized each other, and he knew his friend, Captain Rummel. Was he also, I apologize if you mentioned this, but was he also from the area, Taylor? Or did they
I
just
don't.
know each other from being on
They
the
just
same maritime
they
route?
just knew each other.
Got it.
Oh, Brian Richter says this would be a wonderful movie. I think it was made into a bad movie in the 1940s era, a much changed, much jazzed up. There was a fatal love triangle introduced into the story that didn't exist here. And there have been several books, include one rather recent that's come out.
Yeah, he said it was a fantastic story, which I agree. The history does this very often. The details that emerge are just something that you wonder why we even have to write fiction, because it's all it's all there. Were there ever Black crews on slaver ships? Was that
I
something
don't
you
know
know?
the answer. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but the comprehensive history of African Americans at sea is titled Blackjacks. I'll give you the author. It's very well known in the literature. It's by W. Jeffrey Bolster. It's titled Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail. He's a University of New Hampshire historian, and this is a very important work. So that would be the place to look. And Susan
So thank
Erickson,
you.
you're
Oh, sorry.
you're
Thank you, Gail, for that question. And then we do have a comment from Susan. Go ahead. Go ahead, Tim.
well, maybe I don't know. I don't know if we can find that and how bad that movie is. It seemed like a real kind of a potboiler, 40s era B movie, So I don't know if it's still obtainable, but it'd be interesting to find out. So we'd have to screen it before we forced anybody to watch it.
That's a good point. And it said, Susan says that the movie was called The Decks Ran Red, starring Dorothy Dandridge. So, okay, I'm going to look through the comments. Oh, Michael Panko says it would be a very depressing movie. Yes, although, even though Adams and Sawyer served, was it 5 or 6 years for this crime?
6 years, yeah.
6 years for this crime. And they were released, correct me if I'm wrong, but that never was like removed from their record, right? They didn't have that.
No, there were
ruling
political
ever.
there were political considerations. Both Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft didn't want to upset Southern interests that were important to their political fortunes. So they tried to do as little as possible to kind of find their sense of balance between justice and not offending white sympathies in the South.
As we said earlier, yikes.
Yeah.
Yikes. Okay, so I went through all the questions and comments in the chat. One wrapping up question I had, you mentioned earlier that you were calling in from your 130-year house. Did I hear that?
Oh, we've recently discovered our house was built over 230 years ago.
230 years ago. I missed a whole century.
Yeah, before 1794. So we're finding all kinds of interesting and sometimes conflicting information. But we had a woman who's now in her 60s whose grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather owned this place. So we have all kinds of interesting intel that we're just uncovering and digging into. And I've been working on renovating this place, so I'm discovering their work and feeling like I'm communing with these guys who were working on this house before me and leaving little notes for the people who'll be working on this house after me. Of course, I threw a copy of the newspaper into the encapsulated floor and put little
Yes.
notes on lamps and stuff like that. Just fun stuff for people to find one day.
I frequently make the joke that I am trying to stock the historical societies of the future.
Yeah.
With my photo albums and scrapbooks or what have you. It's like they're going to need something to put in those collections. So that house is lucky to have you, and I'm sure happy to have you.
We're happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Tim, on Chebacco Chats. We are getting comment from Carl, great program. You are a great guest, of course.
Thanks,
We're
Carl.
the founder of this program. So I do appreciate you being here today and telling us this fascinating story.
Thanks, Jenna. It's a pleasure.
Well, coming up on Chebacco Chats next Thursday, April 20th at 4:30 p.m., we welcome Jerry Bowers, David Evans, and Dr. Herman Howler of MDI Biological Laboratory to talk about the organization's history of 125 years, including the role of George Dorr and other benefactors in its establishment, a bit about the laboratory's early history on MDI, and some of the current work being done at the laboratory today. Chebacco Chats are available to view on our website the week after they air. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at MDI History to be notified when we upload them. We are currently seeking feedback on this web series for the next couple of weeks. That window of feedback is going to be open. So if you haven't taken a survey yet on our website, please do so. We'd really appreciate it. Just takes a couple minutes. The new Chebacco will be delivered to members' mailboxes in a few short weeks. We have received those at the schoolhouse, and we're really excited to get them out to you. Tim's article is in there, so I think it's on page 84. I might not be right exactly, but it's in that area. You can become a member or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org. Have a good evening, everyone. Tim, it was great to talk to you again.
Same here, Jenna. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.